My husband beat me for refusing to let his mother move in and take over our home. Then he calmly went to bed. The next morning, he tossed a velvet makeup bag into my lap and said, "My mother's coming for lunch. Cover all that up and smile." When the officer snapped the handcuffs onto my husband's wrists, he looked at me the way he always did when I surprised him, like I was a lamp that had suddenly spoken. "This is my house," he said. I pressed the makeup wipe to my cheek and dragged it down. The concealer peeled away in a single, slow stroke. Under the chandelier, the bruise bloomed into full view, purple-black, raw, spreading from my cheekbone all the way up to my eye socket like a storm system rolling in off the coast. Nobody in that marble foyer made a sound. Not the attorney, not the forensic financial investigator, not the two uniformed officers standing 3 feet from my husband's shoulder, not Beatrice. I let the silence hold for exactly as long as it needed to. "I went to the clinic at 6:30 this morning," I said. "Photographs, medical report, filed with the precinct before 9. Richard stopped breathing. And in that moment, in that gorgeous, terrible silence, I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. I hadn't been angry in a long time. I was finished. I should start at the beginning, or close enough to it. My name is Victoria Aldane, not Victoria Monroe. I never legally changed it, which turned out to be one of 17 small decisions I made in the first 6 months of that marriage that Richard dismissed as women's paranoia. Women's paranoia. That phrase did a lot of work in our house. I met Richard Monroe at a fundraising gala for an art restoration charity I'd quietly supported for years. He was standing near the Flemish oils, holding champagne he wasn't drinking, wearing the particular expression of a man who has been brought somewhere by obligation and intends everyone to know it. I found that honest at the time. I found a lot of things about Richard honest at the time. He was 41. I was 34. He had a name that opened rooms, a jaw like an architectural drawing, and a mother who hadn't liked me from the first handshake. Beatrice Monroe, née Calloway, which she mentioned approximately once per visit, was the kind of woman who weaponized hospitality. She served beautiful food and poisoned the conversation around it. She had pearls for every occasion, and a look she gave daughters-in-law that communicated with surgical precision that you were a temporary inconvenience in a very long family story. I smiled through every dinner. I poured her preferred wine to the preferred line. I wore the colors she didn't hate. I had been doing this for 22 months when Richard first hit me. The first time wasn't the one that left a mark. The first time was almost gentle by the standard of what followed. A shove into the doorframe of our bedroom, my shoulder catching the edge, a bloom of pain that faded in 3 days. I told myself it was the stress of his work, the pressure of the quarterly review. I told myself he'd looked immediately horrified, and that was true. He had. What I didn't notice, what I was too careful not to notice, was that he didn't apologize. He looked horrified in the reflexive animal way of someone who has surprised themselves. Then he straightened his collar and went downstairs. I stood in the doorframe for a long time after that, touching my shoulder, thinking about how long I'd known, on some wordless level, that we were building towards something. I should tell you something about my money, because it matters to everything that follows. My father, Emmett Aldane, was not a wealthy man in the way Richard's family was wealthy. No generations of it, no portraits in hallways. He was an engineer who spent 30 years solving problems quietly and investing the proceeds even more quietly. When he died, 7 years before I met Richard, he left me a sum that was serious without being obscene, a small commercial property in the city's legal district, and a trust structured with such fastidious privacy that my own accountant didn't know its full value until we sat down together in the spring of what would become the last year of my marriage. My father had one rule: never let anyone count your money for you. I had followed that rule. Richard had never been given a real number. Beatrice had assumed, loudly and often in my presence, that I was what she called a comfortable nobody, that I'd had some savings when we married. Nothing serious. She was 40 years and approximately $4 million wrong about that. But she didn't know that. Richard didn't know that. And I'd had, by the time the bruise appeared on my face, a very specific reason for keeping it that way. The property question started 8 months into the marriage. Richard had mentioned, casually, the way he mentioned most things that weren't casual, that his mother needed more space. Her apartment across town was becoming difficult. She was getting older. Family looked after family. Of course, I said the first time. The east wing of our home was 3 rooms and a private bath. It had been my studio. I painted. Nothing gallery-worthy, nothing I'd have shown to strangers, but mine, my easels. My canvases stacked against the wall in a particular order I'd developed over years, the smell of linseed oil and turpentine that I loved the way some people love bread baking. She'd need the space by autumn, he said. I kept smiling. I kept nodding. I also called Prentice Gallo the next morning. Prentice was 53 years old, had spent 22 years doing forensic financial investigation for a firm that worked alongside law firms and private clients, and had the particular manner of someone who had seen every variety of financial manipulation and was not impressed by any of it. He wore the same brand of plain gray suit in every season and asked questions with the economy of a man who charged by the hour. I had been introduced to him by my father's estate attorney years before. I had kept his card. I told Prentice everything: the East Wing, Beatrice, the trust, the property, what I wanted to know. He asked me 2 questions: how much time do you need, and how quiet does this need to be? I said, as long as it takes. Absolute silence. He said, retainer up front. I'll be in touch. 3 weeks later, he called me with the first thread. The charity was called the Harwick Cultural Preservation Foundation. Beatrice Prentice sat on its board, had for 11 years, wore that chairmanship the way she wore her pearls, as decoration that was also armor. The charity funded restoration projects, cultural education programs, and an annual arts gala that generated significant press and even more significant donations. It also, Prentice had discovered, generated a small but consistent secondary flow of funds that did not appear in the public accounts, routed through a service company in Luxembourg. From there, through 2 additional vehicles, to an account in the Cayman Islands that was registered to a holding entity whose ultimate beneficial owner was, after considerable digging through corporate filings in 3 jurisdictions, Beatrice Calloway Monroe. Not large amounts, never large enough to trigger automatic review, but consistent over 9 years, and totaling, by Prentice's conservative accounting, just over $340,000. He sent me the summary in an encrypted file at 2:47 in the morning, because he kept unusual hours and had warned me he would. I read it in bed, next to Richard, who was sleeping with the easy, untroubled depth of someone who believed he was in complete control of his life. I set my phone face down on the nightstand. I lay there in the dark for a very long time. I wasn't angry, I was calculating. There's a difference, and it matters. Anger makes you move too fast. Calculation makes you wait for the right moment. I was getting very good at waiting. I called Seraphine Sterling 2 days later. Seraphine had been practicing family law for 16 years. She was 47, precise in a way that went beyond professional habit, and had a reputation among her colleagues for having never lost a property dispute she'd taken to hearing. My father's estate attorney had mentioned her name once, in the context of, if you ever need someone who plays the long game. I'd looked her up and kept her name filed away the way I kept a lot of things. Quiet, private, safe. She listened to my situation without interrupting me. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. The property, she said. You bought it before the marriage? Through my blind trust. His name is not on the deed. He signed an occupancy agreement. I presented it as a formality. Something about insurance and liability. He didn't read it. Another pause. And he's been representing it as a marital asset? To his mother, to their social circle, to himself, I suspect. I heard the soft sound of her writing something. Tell me about the recordings. I had started recording 10 weeks earlier. Not every conversation. I was careful about what was useful and what was noise. I had a small device, the size of a pack of gum, purchased through a third party and registered to an LLC that Prentice had helped me establish for a different purpose 3 years prior. It sat beneath the sideboard behind Richard's chair in the dining room, hidden behind the carved wooden scrollwork, held in place by 2 strips of museum putty. I told Seraphine what was on the recordings. She was quiet for a long moment. Victoria, she said, I need you to understand what you're building. I know what I'm building. Then I need you to not do anything impulsive before it's finished. I've been waiting 22 months, I said. I'm very good at not doing anything impulsive. She said, I'll need everything. Give me 2 weeks. The bruise happened on a Thursday. We had argued about the East Wing again. Beatrice had called that afternoon. I'd listened from the landing, which Richard knew was possible and apparently no longer cared about, and told Richard that my resistance was becoming a problem, that she'd given me enough time to come to terms with the situation, that I was behaving like a woman who didn't understand her position. Richard came upstairs with that particular quietness that I'd learned to recognize the way farmers learn weather. I was sitting at the vanity, not doing anything, just sitting. He told me it was settled. His mother was moving in. I would clear the East Wing by Friday. I would dismiss Margolane, our housekeeper, who had been with me for 4 years before the marriage and who Richard had decided was too familiar, and I would stop whatever I was plotting. That last word surprised me. I kept my face still. I'm not plotting anything, I said. He hit me. Not the way he'd shoved me before. This was deliberate. Open palm, but hard enough that I hit the edge of the vanity table and went down to one knee. The sound was very loud in the quiet room. He stood over me for a moment. Then he went to bed. I knelt on the floor for a while. My ear was ringing. I pressed my fingers to my cheek and felt the heat already spreading under the skin. I stayed completely still until I heard his breathing change into the slow rhythm of sleep. Then I got up, went to the bathroom, looked at my face under the cold light, looked at myself for a long time. I texted Seraphine one word, Saturday. She replied within 4 minutes. Confirmed. I was at the private clinic, Crestfield Medical Associates, a small practice in a quiet part of the city that I had researched 6 weeks earlier, specifically because they offered discreet documentation services, and a physician, Oswaldo Ferreira, who had 18 years of experience and had testified as a medical witness in 14 legal proceedings. I was there by 6:20 in the morning. Oswaldo Ferreira was a small man with reading glasses he wore on a chain, and the practiced, unhurried manner of someone who has documented the evidence of violence many times and understands that detachment is a form of respect. He photographed the bruise under 3 different lighting conditions. He documented dimensions, coloration, and the specific pattern consistent with an open hand strike. He noted the secondary bruising at my shoulder, the older one, mostly faded. He signed and notarized the report. He asked me, with careful neutrality, if I was safe where I was currently staying. For 2 more days, I said. He nodded slowly and handed me the sealed envelope. I drove home. Richard was still asleep. I photographed the envelope on the kitchen counter with my phone, time-stamped, then locked it in the small fireproof safe in my studio, the one Richard didn't know the combination to, because he had never shown interest in the East Wing's contents. Another small thing I'd been grateful for. Then I made coffee, set it on Richard's Richard's side of the table. When he came downstairs, he tossed the velvet makeup bag into my lap without looking at me. My mother's coming at noon. Cover all that up. Wear the blue dress. Smile. I looked down at the concealers, looked back up at the man I'd married. Of course, Richard, I said, and I smiled. Beatrice arrived at exactly 12. She let herself in with the key Richard had given her, against my expressed preference, which Richard had classified as irrational, and swept through the entrance hall like a woman arriving to take inventory. She kissed Richard on both cheeks, looked at me with the specific variety of disinterest she reserved for objects she intended to rearrange. You look tired, Victoria. Her eyes lingered on my cheek, on the careful work of the concealer. Thank you for coming, Beatrice, I said. Lunch is ready. I poured her wine. To the preferred line, not a millimeter over, not under. I had learned her preferences the way you learn a complicated lock. She sat in my chair at the head of the table, not Richard's chair, mine. I sat in the middle and said nothing. Richard tells me you've come to your senses, she said, cutting into the roast I'd prepared that morning with the particular composure of someone who has cooked through much worse things than anticipated house guests. Did he say that? The movers come Saturday. You'll have the east wing clear by tomorrow. She sipped her wine, set it down with the light click of total confidence. And that housekeeper, she goes, too familiar. You need proper house staff, not a confidant. Richard put his hand over mine on the table. See, Mother? Victoria just needed time. I kept my face soft and agreeable. I kept my eyes slightly lowered, the way Beatrice had always preferred. It made her feel safe, I'd learned. It made her feel like I'd been properly understood. Of course, I said softly. Beneath the sideboard, behind the carved scrollwork, behind Richard's chair, the recorder was running. They relaxed over the second course. That was the thing about people who believed they were winning. They relaxed. They got generous with themselves. Beatrice's voice rose slightly as she talked about her plans for the wing. Richard laughed at something she said about a mutual acquaintance. They were easy together in the way of people who shared a project. The project was me, my compliance, my diminishment, and then Beatrice, full of wine and certainty, leaned across the table as though I wasn't seated 3 feet away. I told you she'd fold, she said to Richard. Girls from her background always do. Pretty little nobodies. No real power. Richard cut into his meat. She had some savings when we married. Nothing serious. I set down the wine bottle. Is that what you think, Richard? He looked up, the fork stilled in his hand. Don't start, he said. But I saw it. Just for a flicker. Just for a second. A shadow of something moving across his face. Not guilt, not remorse. Something colder and more useful. Doubt. Good, I thought. Let it grow. After lunch, Beatrice followed me into the kitchen. She closed the door behind her with the definitive click of someone who has done this before. The private conversation after the public performance. This was where the real business happened. I knew that. She knew that. I stood at the sink with my back to her, running hot water over the dishes. I heard her heels on the tile. You're a clever girl, she said, and from her mouth it was not a compliment. But you're not clever enough. I kept washing. I have friends on every charity board in this city, every arts committee, every preservation society, every social organization that matters in this entire social landscape. Her voice was smooth and quiet, the practiced quiet of someone who has threatened people many times and knows that volume is amateur. If I decide you're a problem, I will make you disappear from every room worth being in. No one will return your calls. No one will remember your name. I turned off the water. I dried my hands on the kitchen towel, slowly, carefully, each finger. I turned around, and I let her see my real face for the first time. Not the soft eyes, not the agreeable set of my jaw. I let her see me. The version of me that had been sitting behind the performance for 22 months, watching, collecting, waiting. She paused. Beatrice, I said quietly, a family can do that too. She opened her mouth. The doorbell rang. I walked past her, through the kitchen door, down the hall. I reached the foyer before Richard did. I opened the door. 4 people on the porch, in the pale Saturday afternoon light. Seraphine Sterling in a charcoal coat, a briefcase at her side, completely unhurried. Prentice Gallo in his gray suit, a document case under one arm. 2 uniformed officers from the city precinct. I knew their names because Seraphine had confirmed them with me by text at 8 that morning. Officers Damaris Vowell and Caden Orusu, both assigned to the domestic crimes unit. Richard appeared at my shoulder. His face went the particular white of a man whose entire reality is rearranging itself faster than he can track. Seraphine didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped over the threshold with the calm of someone who already knew she had every legal right to be there. Mrs. Victoria Monroe is the sole legal owner of this property, she said. Good afternoon, Mr. Monroe. Richard's voice came out wrong, thin and dislocated, like it belonged to someone else. Victoria, what did you do? I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, found the file I'd been carrying there since morning, pressed play. Beatrice's voice filled the marble foyer, crisp, unmistakable. Pretty little nobodies, no real power. Richard's head swiveled toward the dining room, toward the sideboard. I pressed the second file, the sound of the impact. My own sharp intake of breath. I heard it now from outside myself, from a distance, and it was smaller than I remembered, and worse, somehow, for being small. Then Richard's voice. You're living in my house. You're nothing. The words hung in the air of the foyer. He lunged for the phone. Caden Orusu stepped between us with the measured, practiced ease of someone who had done this precise thing many times. Sir, step back, now. Richard stopped, and I, slowly, deliberately, under the full light of the chandelier, in front of all of them, pressed the makeup wipe to my cheekbone, and drew it it down. The concealer came away in a single pale streak. The bruise underneath did not move, did not hide, did not negotiate. It was simply there, documented, irrefutable. Richard stopped breathing. Photographs, I said into the silence. Medical report from Crestfield Medical Associates, dated this morning at 6:42, signed by Oswaldo Ferreira, witnessed, notarized, and filed with the precinct before 9 o'clock. Exhibit A through D, as referenced in the supplemental filing Seraphine submitted Thursday. Damaris Vowell stepped forward with the handcuffs already unclipped. Turn around, sir. She set me up. His voice cracked on the last word. This is my house. You can't do this. This house, I said, was purchased through my blind trust before we married. Your name appears on no deed. You signed an occupancy agreement. You called reading legal documents women's paranoia. He turned to Beatrice. Full, desperate rotation, like a drowning man looking for anything solid. She was standing very still in the doorway between the hall and the foyer, one hand at her pearls. She was looking at me, and then Seraphine turned to her, held out a second envelope with the precise, polite finality of someone delivering something that cannot be refused. Mrs. Beatrice Monroe. The supplemental filing includes you as a named co-conspirator in the spousal financial coercion scheme. Additionally, our forensic financial investigator, she nodded briefly at Prentice, who was already opening his document case, has filed a separate referral with the Financial Crimes Division. Wire fraud. Misappropriation of charitable funds, routed through the Harwick Cultural Preservation Foundation to offshore accounts registered to Callaway Meridian Holdings. Beneficial owner confirmed as yourself. 9 years, 37 separate transfers, $342,000 in total. The pearls at Beatrice's throat trembled. Richard turned to her, his mouth open. Mother. His voice had gone to almost nothing. You stole from the charity. Beatrice did not look at her son. She looked at me. And for the first time in 22 months, I saw it. Fear. Not the controlled, performative worry of a woman managing a social situation. Not the cold calculation I'd seen every Sunday at her dinner table. This was the real thing. The animal thing. Stripped of jewelry and confidence and practiced authority. She was afraid of me. Of what I'd built. Of what I knew. Of how long I'd been building it while she sat in my chair and cut into my food and planned the disposal of my life. Damaris Vowell walked Richard to the door with her hand on his arm. He didn't resist. He seemed to have lost the understanding of what his body was supposed to do next. At the threshold, he turned to look at me one more time. I don't know what he was hoping to see. I don't know if it was a last appeal or guilt or something more primitive. The hope that the woman you've diminished for 2 years will, at the final moment, soften. I looked back at him. I didn't soften. They took him in the back of the patrol car at 2:17 in the afternoon. Prentice walked me through the immediate next steps with the same flat efficiency he brought to everything. The formal separation of the property documentation, the injunction Seraphine had already secured preventing removal of assets, the financial freeze that Prentice's referral had triggered on the accounts they'd identified. Beatrice sat at the kitchen table, my kitchen table, in my kitchen, in my house, while a second officer spoke with her. She had declined water. She had declined to say anything further without counsel. She held her hands folded in her lap with the rigid composure of a woman who still believed, on some reptilian level, that composure would save her. I stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. I thought about all the Sunday dinners, all the wine poured to the preferred line, all the times I'd let her sit in my chair because it was the simpler thing to do. I thought about my father, who had taught me to read a contract before I was 12, who had said, with the quiet certainty of an engineer, the load-bearing walls are the ones nobody bothers to look at. I had been a load-bearing wall this entire time. I had been the structure that held the whole thing up. Richard's social standing was built on the house I owned. His confidence was built on the deference I performed. Beatrice's certainty was built on the compliance she'd mistaken for weakness. I had let them build on me. And then, when every piece was in place, I had simply stepped aside. Seraphine stayed until 5. We went through the formal documentation in the dining room. Richard's chair now pushed back from the table, empty, almost comedically so. I signed what needed signing. She walked me through the timeline. The criminal proceedings would move separately from the civil divorce. The domestic violence filing was complete and would be attached to the restraining order application, which she expected to be granted within 48 hours. The property matter was already settled. There was no legal argument to be made given the trust documentation and the occupancy agreement Richard had signed without reading. He had called it women's paranoia. I called it due diligence. She shook my hand at the door. She had the careful warmth of a professional who doesn't do warmth unprofessionally, which I respected. You were very patient, she said. I had good reasons to be, I said. After she left, I stood in the foyer for a while, under the chandelier, in the silence. The house had never felt like mine. Not really. Not with Richard's presence filling it, not with Beatrice's visits rearranging it psychically even when she wasn't physically there. But now it was simply quiet, and the quiet was mine, and the walls were mine, and the pale winter light coming through the tall windows was landing on floors that belonged to a trust in my name. I went to the east wing. I stood in the doorway of my studio. The easels, the canvases stacked in their specific order, the smell of linseed oil and turpentine, faint under the months of disuse, but there, still there. I sat down on the low stool I used when I painted, and I put my hands in my lap. My hands weren't shaking. They hadn't shaken once. Not at the clinic that morning. Not when I opened the door to Seraphine and the officers. Not when I pulled the wipe across my face. All the shaking had happened months ago, in private, in the dark, in the quiet hours of 4 and 5 in the morning when I had sat with what I was building and understood, fully, what it meant to commit to something this completely. The shaking was done. I touched my cheek, gently, with 2 fingers, the way you test something to understand its reality. The bruise was real. Richard was gone. The house was mine. I picked up a brush. 11 months later. The criminal proceedings settled in March. Richard entered a guilty plea on the domestic violence charge. The medical documentation and the audio recording left no meaningful room for a defense, which his attorney communicated to him in terms that apparently took 2 weeks to fully land. He received a sentence that involved community service, a mandatory intervention program, and a restraining order that had, by then, long since been in place. His attorney had argued in the pre-sentencing documentation that Richard was a man of previously good standing in the community who had experienced significant personal stress. I read that phrase in the court filing and thought about how much work that phrase had done in the world, for how many men, for how long. Beatrice's matter moved more slowly, as financial crimes cases do. Prentice's referral had opened doors that the charity's own auditors had subsequently walked through, and the total figure was revised upward, not dramatically, but meaningfully. She had retained very good counsel and was, as of the last filing I'd been informed of, cooperating with investigators in ways her son was finding out about secondhand through mutual acquaintances. She had not contacted me. I had not expected her to. Margolane was back. She had, to her enormous credit, said nothing when I called her, simply, "What time do you need me Monday?" She made a specific soup in the winter months that involved fennel and preserved lemon, and that I had eaten approximately 40 times and was not tired of. She was familiar in all the ways Beatrice had objected to, and I valued her for every one of them. The East Wing was my studio again. I'd had the walls repainted, a particular blue-gray I'd been thinking about for years, and installed better north-facing light through new windows that cost more than I'd budgeted and were completely worth it. I was working on something large, a series. It didn't have a name yet. It had a feeling, though, something opening. Something stripped of its surface layer and showing what was underneath, the actual structure, the load-bearing walls, the things that were always there even when nobody was looking at them. My father would have appreciated it, I thought. I stood at the canvas on a Wednesday morning in November, brush in hand, the winter light coming clean and cold through the new windows, and I felt the exact specific texture of being free, not happy, not yet entirely. Healing isn't a single moment, whatever the stories tell you, but free, mine. I pressed the brush to the canvas, and I began. He thought he married a woman who didn't understand her position. He was right. I understood it completely. That was the whole point.